The moment the words IRS investigation and Meghan Markle collided in the same sentence, something inside the carefully polished illusion of royal reinvention cracked, and not quietly, not gracefully, but violently, like glass shattering in the middle of a silent palace hallway. Because this wasn't just an audit, this wasn't just paperwork. This was a full-scale institutional confrontation that dragged Meghan Markle's carefully constructed empire out of the shadows and into the harsh, blinding glare of federal scrutiny. Behind closed doors, insiders whispered that Meghan had spent years crafting an image of untouchable legitimacy, wrapping herself in the invisible armor of royal prestige even after walking away from the crown. But now, suddenly, that armor wasn't protecting her anymore. It was being examined, dissected, and questioned by the very authorities capable of dismantling everything she built. It began with a quiet request. No cameras, no public spectacle, just federal investigators asking a simple but devastating question: was Meghan Markle using the illusion of royal backing to fuel a private empire disguised as public service? And when that question reached the marble corridors of the royal establishment, the reaction wasn't confusion, it was alarm. Because behind palace walls, officials already knew something was deeply wrong. They had seen the signs, the branding that danced dangerously close to royal symbolism, the language that blurred the line between personal ambition and institutional authority, the subtle implication that the crown's legacy still flowed through Meghan's private ventures, even though she had walked away years ago. And now, with the R's circling, those blurred lines weren't just controversial, they were potentially catastrophic. Whispers turned into emergency meetings, meetings turned into sealed dossiers, and then came the moment that stunned everyone watching. The royal family didn't defend Meghan. They distanced themselves, coldly, publicly, definitively. Behind the scenes, internal records were pulled, examined, and handed over with a level of speed that insiders described as almost surgical. There was no hesitation, no attempt to shield her. Instead, the message was unmistakable. Whatever Meghan had built, she built it alone. And that message hit like a bomb. Because Meghan's entire public identity had been built on the lingering shadow of royal legitimacy, the idea that even in exile, she still carried the crown's invisible blessing. But now, that blessing was being publicly revoked in everything but name. At the center of the storm was Archewell, the foundation that Meghan had presented to the world as her humanitarian legacy, her proof that she had transcended royal duty and evolved into something bigger, something more independent, something more powerful. But federal investigators weren't interested in symbolism. They were interested in numbers, and the numbers didn't whisper. They screamed. Donations had fallen sharply. Expenses had exploded. Millions flowed through the foundation, but only a fraction appeared to reach actual charitable causes. Instead, enormous sums vanished into administrative costs, travel expenses, security arrangements, and operational overhead. To investigators, it looked less like a charity and more like a financial labyrinth where money entered clearly but exited mysteriously. And then came the revelation that truly shook everything. Archewell had quietly shifted its financial structure at a moment when scrutiny began to rise. To outsiders, it looked like a technical adjustment. To investigators, it looked like a strategic maneuver designed to reduce transparency. The timing was impossible to ignore, because nothing terrifies an empire built on perception more than the sudden demand for transparency. And insiders whispered that Meghan knew the walls were closing in long before the public ever heard the word investigation. But it wasn't just Archewell. Parallel to the charity was Meghan's lifestyle brand, a glossy, aspirational extension of her personal identity, carefully designed to position her not just as a former royal, but as a global tastemaker. The brand promised exclusivity, prestige, royal adjacent elegance. But behind the glamorous packaging, investigators uncovered a disturbing contradiction. Massive quantities of unsold inventory sat untouched in warehouses, contradicting the public narrative of overwhelming demand. The illusion of instant success, the sold-out launches, the glowing headlines, the aura of unstoppable momentum began to look less like reality and more like carefully orchestrated theater. And suddenly, everything Meghan had spent years building began to look fragile. Inside private circles, the panic was impossible to hide. Because Meghan understood something most outsiders didn't, perception was everything. Her power didn't come from official titles anymore. It came from the belief that she still carried royal significance, that she was still connected, still protected, still elevated above ordinary consequences. But the Ears investigation threatened to strip away that perception layer by layer, exposing the machinery behind the myth. And once that machinery became visible, the magic would disappear forever. Even more devastating was the royal family's response. They didn't rage, they didn't argue, they didn't defend her. They simply stepped aside, and in doing so, they left Meghan standing alone in the path of the storm. Behind closed doors, insiders described the mood as cold, clinical, and final. This wasn't a family disagreement. This was institutional self-preservation. The crown had survived wars, scandals, abdications, and betrayals. It wasn't about to risk its credibility for someone who had already walked away. And that realization may have been the most terrifying moment of all. Because Meghan had spent years believing she could exist in both worlds, outside the royal system, yet still benefiting from its aura, independent, yet still elevated, detached, yet still protected. But the investigation shattered that illusion completely. Now, she wasn't operating in the protected realm of royal diplomacy. She was operating in the unforgiving world of federal enforcement, where symbolism meant nothing and evidence meant everything. The consequences weren't hypothetical anymore. They were real. Legal exposure, financial collapse, public humiliation. Every headline, every revelation, every leak pushed Meghan closer to a point of no return. And insiders whispered that the pressure wasn't just professional, it was personal. Because this wasn't just about money. It was about credibility, identity, legacy. The very narrative Meghan had crafted about herself was being challenged at its foundation. And as investigators dug deeper, one question echoed louder than all the others. Had Meghan Markle built her post-royal empire on genuine independence, or on the lingering illusion of royal power she was never meant to use? Because if that illusion collapsed completely, it wouldn't just destroy a foundation, it would destroy everything. What terrified Meghan Markle the most wasn't the investigation itself, it was the silence that followed. Because silence in the world she once dominated meant something far more dangerous than accusations. Silence meant abandonment. And behind the scenes, that abandonment was happening faster than anyone outside her inner circle could see. The phones that once rang endlessly with offers, partnerships, invitations, and endorsements suddenly went quiet. The same executives who once praised her as the future of global influence were now hesitating, delaying, waiting to see how deep the damage would go, waiting to see whether aligning with Meghan Markle was still an asset or a liability they couldn't afford to touch. Inside the carefully controlled environment of her private operations, the panic was no longer theoretical. It was operational. Meetings stretched longer. Advisors spoke in quieter tones. Legal teams began reviewing documents that had once been treated as routine. Because now, nothing was routine anymore. Every transaction, every expense, every public statement carried the potential to become evidence. And evidence didn't care about public image. Evidence didn't care about narrative. Evidence only cared about truth. And insiders whispered that Meghan understood exactly how dangerous that shift was. Because she had built her empire on controlling perception. But now, perception was no longer under her control. The most devastating blow wasn't even the ears itself. It was what happened after the royal institution made its position unmistakably clear. By formally distancing itself, the monarchy had effectively removed the invisible shield Meghan had relied on for years. That shield wasn't written into law. It wasn't contractual. It was psychological. It was the unspoken understanding that Meghan was still part of something larger, something untouchable. But now, that understanding had been erased, and once erased, it couldn't be restored, because the crown had made a choice, not to defend her, not to protect her, but to protect itself. And that choice sent shockwaves through every corner of Meghan's carefully curated world. Suddenly, her brand, the brand she had positioned as aspirational, elegant, royal adjacent, began to look dangerously exposed. Retail partners grew cautious. Distributors hesitated. Behind closed doors, contracts were reviewed with new skepticism. Because association with Meghan no longer guaranteed prestige. It now carried risk, financial risk, legal risk, reputational risk, and in the ruthless ecosystem of global business, risk was contagious. No one wanted to be standing too close when the collapse finally happened. But perhaps the most devastating realization came from within her own narrative. Meghan had always presented herself as the architect of her own destiny, the woman who escaped the constraints of tradition to build something entirely new. But now, the investigation threatened to reframe that story completely. Instead of independence, critics saw opportunism. Instead of empowerment, they saw exploitation. Instead of reinvention, they saw miscalculation. And that shift in perception was something Meghan couldn't easily reverse, because perception, once broken, never returns to its original form. Behind closed doors, insiders whispered about the growing strain not just professionally, but personally, because this wasn't just Meghan's empire, it was a shared legacy. And as the investigation intensified, the pressure began to fracture the fragile equilibrium that had held everything together. Decisions that once felt bold now looked reckless. Strategies that once felt visionary now looked dangerously naive. And the consequences weren't just financial, they were existential. Because everything Meghan had built depended on one fragile assumption that she could exist outside the royal system while still benefiting from its aura. But now that aura had evaporated completely, and without it, she was no longer operating above scrutiny. She was operating inside it, fully exposed, fully accountable, fully vulnerable. Meanwhile, investigators continued their work with cold, relentless precision. They weren't interested in headlines. They weren't interested in public sympathy. They were interested in patterns, financial patterns, structural patterns, behavioral patterns, and patterns once established told stories far more powerful than any public statement ever could. Stories about intent, stories about strategy, stories about whether the line between charity and personal ambition had been crossed deliberately or carelessly. Every day the investigation continued, the pressure intensified, because investigations didn't just uncover facts, they uncovered contradictions, and contradictions were where narratives died. Meghan's entire public identity had been built on coherence, the image of a woman guided by purpose, integrity, and vision. But if that coherence shattered, if investigators exposed inconsistencies between image and reality, the damage wouldn't just be financial, it would be permanent. And perhaps that was the most terrifying part of all, because empires built on money could recover from financial loss, but empires built on perception rarely survived the collapse of credibility. And as the walls closed in, Meghan faced a reality she had spent years avoiding. She was no longer controlling the story. The story was controlling her. Every headline, every leak, every investigation milestone pushed her further away from the carefully curated image she had fought so hard to maintain. And in its place emerged something far more dangerous: uncertainty. Uncertainty about her financial future. Uncertainty about her public standing. Uncertainty about whether her empire could survive the storm gathering around it. And somewhere behind closed doors, in rooms shielded from cameras and headlines, Meghan Markle, the woman who had once defied the most powerful institution in the world and walked away believing she could build something greater, was now confronting the possibility that everything she built might collapse under the weight of scrutiny she could no longer escape. Because this wasn't just an investigation. This was a reckoning. And for the first time since she walked away from the crown, Meghan Markle wasn't defining her own destiny anymore. She was waiting for someone else to decide it. For someone else to decide it. For someone else to decide it. For someone else.